This wasn't an accident. What's happening right now didn't come from hesitation, confusion, or bad planning. It came from restraint. And restraint is something NFL franchises almost never have. When you step back and really look at how the Cleveland Browns have handled their quarterback room, one thing becomes clear very quickly. The loud chaos everyone expected never came. No desperate trades, no panic draft picks, no dramatic statements from ownership promising immediate fixes. Instead, there's been silence. And in the NFL, silence usually means something is already decided. Most teams telegraph insecurity. They overcorrect. They chase headlines. They leak urgency through every move they make. Cleveland didn't do that. Even with questions swirling, even with analysts insisting the Browns were running out of time, even with fans begging for clarity, the organization stayed still. And that's the first clue that this wasn't about football instincts, it was about control. Because organizations that don't know what they're doing rush to prove they do. Organizations that already know their direction don't feel the need to explain it. That's why the moment Shedeur Sanders entered the picture, the energy shifted. Not loudly, subtly. The conversation stopped being about survival and started becoming about timing. The Browns didn't react to him like a lottery ticket or a backup plan. They reacted like he was something delicate, something that needed space, something that could be damaged if handled the wrong way. And teams don't behave that way with quarterbacks they're unsure about. The outside world framed it as patience, or worse, indecision. But patience implies waiting without a plan. What Cleveland showed was something else entirely. They limited variables, they reduced noise, they avoided introducing competition that would fracture attention. And in a league obsessed with urgency, that's a strange move, unless urgency isn't the priority. Because if winning right now were the only goal, the Browns would have forced the issue. They didn't. And that alone tells you this story isn't operating on the usual timeline. Here's the part most people miss. Quarterback chaos is useful when you want answers quickly. It's terrible when you want to build belief. Chaos creates daily storylines, headlines, pressure. And pressure doesn't just affect performance, it affects perception. Cleveland didn't want Shedeur entering a league-defined narrative about fighting for reps, earning trust, or scrambling to justify his existence. They wanted him positioned before the evaluation ever began. That takes intention, and intention, when it comes to quarterbacks, usually comes from the top. Nothing about this rollout feels rushed, but nothing about it feels accidental either. His presence hasn't been hidden, it's been curated. When he speaks, it lands. When he's shown, it feels deliberate. There's no scrambling to explain what he is or what he isn't. No frantic messaging about competition or open battles. That language matters. Teams default to it when they're uncertain. Cleveland didn't. They left gaps instead. And those gaps invite speculation, curiosity, and conversation, which is exactly how you introduce something without forcing it. This is where the story gets uncomfortable for traditional fans. Because what if the Browns weren't trying to fix a quarterback problem at all? What if they were managing a transition? One that required patience not because Sanders wasn't ready, but because the environment wasn't yet optimized. Most franchises throw quarterbacks into dysfunction and hope talent wins. Cleveland is doing the opposite. They're shaping the surroundings first, then letting the player grow into them. That's not the behavior of a desperate team. That's the behavior of a controlled one. From the outside, it looks passive. From the inside, it looks calculated. You don't keep the door half open unless you want someone specific to walk through it, and you don't keep refusing to slam it shut unless you're protecting what's on the other side. Every non-move, every delay, every refusal, chase alternatives quietly increases the importance of Sanders' presence. That's not how you treat an experiment. That's how you treat an investment that can't be rushed without losing value. What's especially telling is how little has been said. The Browns haven't tried to sell this plan publicly. No press conference, no declarative statements, just patterns. And patterns are harder to dispute than quotes. When organizations lie, they talk more. When they're confident, they let behavior do the work. Cleveland's behavior has been consistent. Protect the runway, reduce threats, preserve optionality. Those are business decisions as much as football ones, maybe more. The real intrigue isn't whether Sanders starts soon. That's a surface-level debate. The real question is why the Browns seem unconcerned with answering it. Teams under pressure rush clarity. Teams executing a longer play don't need it yet. If Sanders were just another name on the depth chart, the organization would have hedged aggressively. Instead, they've done the opposite. They've removed obstacles without announcing intent, and that's the cleanest way to reshape a franchise without triggering resistance. This isn't a traditional development arc. There's no urgency to prove value immediately, no manufactured competition to generate headlines. There's just a quiet understanding that timing matters as much as talent. And when timing matters this much, it usually means the upside is bigger than wins and losses. Because you don't rebuild patiently around someone unless you believe the return extends far beyond Sunday afternoons. So before anyone asks whether this plan will work, it's worth acknowledging something far more important. The Browns didn't stumble into this moment. They engineered it slowly, carefully, intentionally. And once you see that, the question isn't whether Shedeur Sanders fits the future, it's why the future already seems to be waiting for him. The decision that confused everyone wasn't something the Browns did, it was something they refused to do. At a time when nearly every struggling franchise would have panicked, Cleveland stayed unusually calm. No aggressive trade packages leaked to insiders. No early-round quarterback picks dominated mock drafts tied to the team. No last-minute veteran signings to quiet the noise. For a league addicted to movement, the lack of action was jarring. And for analysts, it didn't read as strategy, it read as hesitation. From the outside, it looked irresponsible. Questions were already hanging over the position. Performance concerns hadn't magically disappeared. The noise around the room was loud enough that most teams would have felt forced to respond publicly. But Cleveland Browns didn't flinch. They let criticism stack up. They let commentators fill the silence with assumptions. And that's exactly why people missed what was really happening. Because when fans and analysts expect urgency, stillness feels like weakness. In reality, it can be leverage. The common narrative was simple. Cleveland didn't know what it had, or worse, Cleveland was stuck, trapped by contracts, afraid to admit mistakes, paralyzed by uncertainty. That explanation spread quickly because it fit the league's usual patterns. Teams that don't act fast are assumed to be lost. But that assumption only holds when you believe the goal is immediate correction. What if the goal was not correction at all? What if it was preservation? This is where the decision not to draft another quarterback early becomes critical. That move alone would have reset expectations instantly. It would have reassured fans, it would have pleased talk shows, and it would have injected short-term excitement. Cleveland passed on that release valve, not once, but repeatedly, and that's not a coincidence you can explain away with bad scouting.
Poor timing. Passing on urgency, especially when it's readily available, usually means the urgency isn't aligned with the plan. Adding another highly touted quarterback would have done more than add competition. It would have fractured the narrative. Suddenly, attention gets split. Media questions change. Development timelines compress. Every rep becomes symbolic. Every mistake turns into a referendum. That environment doesn't just test players, it reshapes how they're perceived before they ever settle in. Cleveland chose not to introduce that volatility, and teams don't avoid volatility unless they believe it threatens something more valuable than short-term reassurance. This is why calling the move indecision misses the point entirely. Indecision creates inconsistency. This was consistent restraint. Every off-season opportunity to shake things up was met with the same response: patience. And patience, when repeated under pressure, stops being passive. It becomes intentional. Especially when the cost of patience includes public criticism, fan frustration, and endless speculation. No front office endures that kind of noise accidentally. The league is built on fear of falling behind. Miss on a quarterback, and you're reset for years. That fear drives most decisions. Cleveland, strangely, didn't act like a team afraid of missing out. They acted like a team confident they already had something worth protecting. And that's unsettling because it contradicts everything people expect from a franchise that's been burned before. It suggests learning, it suggests control, it suggests someone decided that adding options would actually reduce value rather than increase it. What made the decision even more confusing was how little they tried to justify it. There were no defensive explanations, no long speeches about internal evaluations or trust in the room. The front office didn't overcorrect with messaging, they simply stayed on course. In a league where narrative management is half the job, refusing to manage the narrative is itself a strategy. Let people assume confusion. Let people underestimate intent. Those assumptions create cover. And while critics debated what Cleveland failed to do, they ignored what Cleveland successfully avoided. No artificial quarterback controversy, no forced timeline, no public pressure campaign disguised as competition. Instead, there was room, space for development without constant comparison, space for one name to remain quietly centered in the conversation without being shoved into the spotlight prematurely. That kind of restraint only works if everyone at the top agrees on who that space is for. What looked like stalling was actually filtering. By not adding more voices to the room, the Browns controlled the signal-to-noise ratio. They shaped what mattered internally while letting the outside world argue over what didn't. And that's how confusion becomes useful. When everyone's focused on what you're not doing, they stop questioning what you are. That's the shift that matters. The Browns didn't choose chaos because chaos forces answers too early. They chose ambiguity because ambiguity buys time. And time, in this case, isn't about waiting to see what happens. It's about letting a plan mature without interference. Once you understand that, the decision that confused everyone starts to look less like a mistake and more like the first visible move in a much longer play. To understand why this situation feels so different, you have to start with the man at the very top. Jimmy Haslam doesn't think like most NFL owners, and that's not an insult or a compliment, it's a statement of fact. He didn't come up through coaching trees or front offices. He didn't build his identity around film rooms or draft boards. He came from the business world, and that background
changes how he interprets success, risk, and patience. When Haslam looks at a franchise, he doesn't just see a roster, he sees a product. That distinction is uncomfortable for fans who still believe football decisions exist in a vacuum, but ownership rarely lives in that vacuum anymore. Modern franchises are massive enterprises, media rights, sponsorships, global streaming deals, merchandise pipelines, stadium investments. All of it matters, and when those factors matter, quarterback decisions stop being purely football-driven. They become brand-driven. Haslam has shown time and again that he's willing to absorb short-term criticism if it serves a broader business vision. That mentality is stamped all over what the Browns are doing right now. The easiest way to see it is in how Cleveland talks about itself. Wins are part of the message, but they aren't the entire pitch. There's been an increasing emphasis on growth, reach, relevance, subtle language, but consistent. The Browns aren't just trying to compete inside the division, they're positioning themselves in a league that's rapidly expanding beyond traditional borders. International games, global fan bases, social-first consumption. In that landscape, your most valuable asset isn't just your best player, it's your most marketable one. This is where Haslam's playbook diverges from old-school NFL logic. Traditional ownership prioritizes stability through results. Win first, monetize later. Haslam operates in reverse. Build the platform, then let the wins amplify it. That approach requires patience because platforms don't scale overnight. They require faces, stories, continuity. And continuity is impossible when you're constantly resetting the most visible position in sports. Quarterbacks aren't just athletes anymore, they're entry points. From a business perspective, the idea of repeatedly churning quarterbacks is disastrous. Every reset forces fans to emotionally reinvest. Every failed experiment erodes belief. Haslam seems to understand that stability at quarterback doesn't just help performance, it helps identity, and identity is what sells. That's why the Browns' behavior feels less like a team searching for answers and more like a company defending a thesis. Once you believe in the thesis, you protect it. Haslam's critics often point to past missteps as evidence that he shouldn't be trusted with patience, but that criticism misses how his approach has evolved. The early years were reactive. This phase feels curated. There's a noticeable shift from impulse to infrastructure. That shift doesn't show up in splashy moves, it shows up in what doesn't change. And right now, the Browns haven't changed the one thing everyone expected them to panic about. Instead of chasing the next quick fix, Haslam appears focused on scale. Scale requires a focal point that can carry narrative weight over time. That's not something you find by accident, it's something you commit to early, quietly, and with discipline. You don't announce it because announcements create expectations. Expectations create pressure, and pressure kills long-term brand building before it even begins. There's also a reason Haslam hasn't intervened publicly to clarify the quarterback situation. Owners step in when they need to reassure markets. Silence, in this case, signals comfort. It suggests that the internal plan doesn't require validation. In business, that's often how you know a decision has already passed the debate phase. Execution has begun. Debate is for when outcomes are still undecided. What's happening in Cleveland feels less like football management and more like brand engineering. Haslam isn't optimizing for next season alone. He's optimizing for relevance 5 and 10 years out.
That means embracing players who can transcend the market they play in. It means thinking about how a franchise is perceived globally, not just locally. And it means accepting that football logic will sometimes take a backseat to business logic, even when that frustrates purists. Once you view the Browns through that lens, their quarterback strategy stops looking strange. It starts looking consistent. The patience, the silence, the resistance to outside pressure, all of it aligns with an owner who values control over applause. Haslam isn't trying to win the news cycle. He's trying to build something that doesn't depend on it. And that difference in priorities is the foundation for everything that's followed. At some point, the conversation around Shedeur Sanders stopped being about arm strength, footwork, or read progressions. Not because those things stopped mattering, but because something else began to matter just as much. Presence. The kind that doesn't need to be forced, the kind that changes a room the moment it enters. Sanders carries himself less like a prospect hoping to earn belief, and more like someone already aware that belief has been assigned to him. That difference is subtle, but it's powerful. Quarterbacks are trained to lead huddles. Sanders does something rarer. He leads attention. When he speaks, people listen, not because he's loud or flashy, but because he's deliberate. There's control in his tone, confidence without chaos. That's not accidental. That's the byproduct of understanding that modern quarterbacking extends far beyond Sundays. Teams don't just evaluate whether a quarterback can run an offense anymore. They evaluate whether he can carry a message, absorb scrutiny, and keep a narrative intact when pressure hits. That's where Sanders separates himself from most young players before they ever take meaningful snaps. His marketability didn't appear after he arrived. It came with him. Fans already recognized his name. Media outlets already treated him as relevant. His following wasn't confined to one fan base or one region. That kind of built-in gravity changes how an organization thinks, because attention is a currency now, and Sanders generates it naturally. You don't have to manufacture interest around him, you just have to frame it. What's important here is not hype, but sustainability. Plenty of players flash briefly and disappear. Sanders doesn't feel temporary. His appeal isn't tied to one viral moment or one breakout performance. It's tied to identity. He represents composure, confidence, and clarity. Those qualities translate well beyond the field. Sponsors care about that. Media outlets care about that.
and organizations care about anything that strengthens their presence without increasing volatility. There have been reports of spikes in jersey interest and digital engagement tied to Sanders' appearances. While exact numbers are rarely made public, the trend has been noticeable enough that it hasn't been ignored. Teams track this closely. Merchandise movement feeds directly into valuation models. Engagement metrics influence scheduling, exposure, and partnerships. When a young quarterback moves the needle early, it changes how patient you're willing to be with his development. Because his value isn't frozen while he learns, it grows. Another factor that's easy to underestimate is how comfortable Sanders appears under the microscope. Most rookies shrink when attention increases. They default to generic answers. They struggle to balance authenticity with restraint. Sanders doesn't. He sounds prepared, not rehearsed, but aware. There's a difference. He understands how quickly words travel and how easily narratives can spiral. That awareness protects the organization as much as it protects him. And teams notice when a player makes their job easier without trying to.
Sanders also understands symbolism. Every appearance matters, whether it's a press conference, sideline shot, or a short on-field moment. He doesn't treat these as obligations. He treats them as part of the job. That mindset is uncommon in young quarterbacks and incredibly valuable to teams trying to stabilize perception. The less chaos you create off the field, the more room you have to grow on it. That balance is hard to teach. Sanders already has it. This is why reducing him to just another quarterback option never really fit. Quarterbacks compete for snaps. Faces of franchises compete for longevity. Sanders fits the second category. His presence gives the Browns something most rebuilding teams struggle to find: coherence, a clear through line that fans, media, and partners can latch onto. That coherence doesn't win games by itself, but it makes patience possible, and patience is the rarest resource in the NFL. None of this guarantees success on the field. Talent still has to translate, development still has to happen. But from an organizational standpoint, Sanders represents a rare overlap: talent, temperament, and market appeal converging at the same time. When that happens, teams don't treat the player like a variable, they treat him like an axis, something other decisions begin to orbit. And once that shift occurs, the quarterback is no longer just part of the roster, he becomes part of the infrastructure. The clearest proof that this plan was intentional sits in the actions of the front office, or more accurately, in the actions they chose not to take. Andrew Berry has built a reputation around discipline, and this moment demanded more discipline than most. When outside pressure peaked, when mock drafts flooded timelines, when every segment screamed for urgency, Berry didn't blink. He understood that adding pieces isn't always progress, sometimes it's interference. The Browns had every excuse to reset the room. Draft capital was available, veteran options existed, the optics alone would have justified it. One new quarterback acquisition would have silenced months of criticism overnight, but Berry avoided that relief on purpose, because relief would have come at a cost. A new quarterback doesn't just bring competition, he brings comparison. Comparison compresses timelines. Timelines create impatience, and impatience kills long-term development before it ever stabilizes. By not drafting a quarterback early, the front office sent a message without issuing a statement. This wasn't an open audition. It wasn't a free-for-all. The runway mattered more than the spectacle. Clearing the runway meant eliminating obstacles that could divert attention, fragment reps, or force premature evaluations. It meant protecting development from becoming entertainment. That's a hard sell in a league built on noise, but it's also how you preserve control. Salary cap management plays into this just as much as scouting does. The Browns didn't accidentally land in their current contract situation. They structured it. Expensive deals at the top, flexibility on the margins. A younger quarterback option insulated from immediate financial pressure. This isn't just football math, it's business math. Affordable talent with long-term upside creates optionality. Optionality allows patience, and patience only works if the environment stays stable. Berry's strategy has consistently avoided headline chasing.
No mid-season overreactions, no public commitment traps, no forced declarations about timelines or pecking orders. Instead, everything has been framed around systems, growth, and alignment. That language isn't accidental. It keeps expectations elastic. It allows the organization to adjust without ever appearing to retreat. That's how you manage a slow build without losing credibility.
Another underrated element of clearing the runway is narrative control. The moment you introduce multiple young quarterbacks, the story shifts from development to competition. Reps get tallied, practices get dissected, fan bases pick sides. None of that helps a player still building rhythm and confidence. Barry sidestepped that entirely. He kept the focus narrow, one developmental arc, one long-term target. Everything else was secondary. What's striking is how consistent this approach has been across seasons. This wasn't a one-off draft decision. It was a pattern. Each offseason, the same restraint showed up. Each opportunity to shake the room was declined. Patterns reveal belief. They tell you what an organization values when outside approval is removed, and the Browns have repeatedly valued protection over provocation. Behind the scenes, the front office also ensured coaching, roster construction, and messaging stayed synchronized. You don't clear a runway just by removing competition. You clear it by aligning incentives. Coaches aren't forced to justify sudden changes. Veterans understand their roles. Young players aren't thrown into symbolic battles. Everything feels quieter, and quiet environments are where quarterbacks actually develop. Barry's approach only works if ownership agrees. That alignment matters. A general manager acting alone would fold under pressure. Barry didn't. That tells you this plan wasn't improvised, it was authorized. The patience was baked in. And once patience becomes policy, the front office's job shifts from reacting to protecting. Clearing the runway doesn't guarantee a smooth takeoff, but it dramatically increases the odds. The Browns didn't want Sanders fighting gravity before he was ready. They wanted the environment prepared first. Less turbulence, fewer distractions, no unnecessary crosswinds. That's not how teams treat a backup they're uncertain about. That's how they treat something they're deliberately getting ready to launch. Coaching stability only becomes a priority when the organization believes something is worth protecting long enough to grow. For years, the NFL has treated coaches as disposable parts, especially when quarterbacks fail to materialize quickly. But Cleveland broke from that pattern, and that deviation tells you a lot about what they believe is at stake. Kevin Stefanski isn't just being evaluated on wins and losses anymore. He's being evaluated on alignment. In most situations, pressure produces turnover. Miss expectations, lose the room, reset the staff. That cycle is familiar. What's unusual here is how resistant the Browns have been to disruption, even when results didn't silence critics. That resistance isn't loyalty, it's strategy. When the goal is long-term development, instability becomes the enemy. Systems change, language shifts, trust resets, and quarterbacks, more than any other position, suffer when continuity disappears. Stefanski's offense isn't revolutionary, but it's predictable in the best way. Predictability creates structure, structure creates comfort, and comfort allows a young quarterback to process rather than survive. That matters more than scheme creativity when the objective isn't to force a breakout, but to sustain growth. Cleveland appears far more concerned with creating a stable learning environment than chasing immediate innovation. There's also a messaging component that often goes overlooked. When coaches rotate, narratives fracture. Each new staff brings new terminology, new talking points, new philosophies that players have to publicly adopt. That creates noise. Stability keeps the story coherent. It prevents the quarterback from having to constantly reintroduce himself to the system, the media, and the fan base. One voice, one direction, one developmental arc. That kind of consistency protects perception as much as performance. Stefanski's will has quietly expanded beyond play design. He's become a steward of timing. His job isn't to accelerate anything prematurely. It's to resist the urge to showcase progress before it's ready. That restraint mirrors what's happening above him. You don't rush visibility when you're trying to build something durable. You let it form, then reveal it when it can carry weight without collapsing. This is where coach-quarterback synergy becomes critical. The relationship doesn't need to be flashy, it needs to be stable. Repetition builds trust, trust builds communication, communication prevents panic when adversity hits. Cleveland seems intent on avoiding the common trap where young quarterbacks get yanked between philosophies every time patience runs thin. That trap ruins confidence quickly and publicly. Avoiding it requires organizational discipline. Critics often debate Stefanski's ceiling. That debate misses the point. Right now, ceiling is secondary to control. The Browns aren't searching for the perfect offensive mind, they're maintaining an ecosystem. Swapping out coaches midstream would shatter that ecosystem, reset development, and introduce uncertainty exactly where they've worked to eliminate it. Continuity isn't about comfort, it's about preservation. What also stands out is the absence of public friction. No leaked disagreements, no awkward press conferences, no subtle distancing language. That silence suggests internal agreement. You don't keep a coach in place this long during a transitional phase unless the messaging aligns. Coaches who disrupt brand narratives don't survive long in organizations thinking this way. Stefanski has, which tells you his value right now extends beyond play calling. When an organization believes it has found a quarterback who can anchor both performance and perception, the timeline changes. Development becomes a process, not a race. Coaching stability becomes a shield, not a luxury. Cleveland isn't clinging to Stefanski out of fear. They're keeping him because replacing him would introduce variables they don't want near a developing cornerstone. In that sense, coaching stability isn't conservative, it's protective. It preserves rhythm, it preserves messaging, it preserves trust. And when all three are in place, a quarterback doesn't feel like he's fighting the system. He feels like he's growing within it. That's the environment the Browns appear determined to maintain, and it explains why continuity suddenly matters more than ever. There's one piece of this puzzle that rarely gets discussed openly, mostly because it's uncomfortable and easy to misunderstand. This is where speculation starts, and it matters to frame it that way. No official statements confirm it, no executive has said it out loud. But when you look at the structure, the timing, and the incentives, a pattern begins to emerge. Some around the league believe Deshaun Watson isn't just a starter right now, he's a buffer. From the outside, Watson's contract looks like a problem. Massive financial commitment, limited flexibility, constant scrutiny. Most teams would view that as an anchor, but it's been said that contracts can serve more than one purpose. They can also buy time. Time is exactly what Cleveland seems to be valuing. While Watson handles the immediate expectations, the weekly pressure and the media glare, someone else is allowed to develop without carrying the weight of the franchise. Reports and insider chatter have suggested that this dynamic isn't accidental. Watson absorbs the noise. Every missed throw, every bad stretch, every heated debate funnels toward him. That focus keeps attention away from the developmental timeline happening quietly behind the scenes. It lowers the temperature. And in a league where quarterbacks are chewed up by impatience, lowered temperature is invaluable. None of this means Watson is being pushed aside or written off. It means the organization may be using the current structure to manage risk more intelligently. From a business standpoint, this makes sense. The Browns don't need to rush anything while a high-profile starter is already in place. The public sees continuity. Sponsors see stability. The league sees a plan that appears conventional on the surface. Underneath, development can unfold at a healthier pace. If this theory holds any weight, Watson's role right now isn't just about winning games, it's about absorbing volatility that could otherwise derail a long-term investment. It's also important to be clear about what this isn't. This isn't sabotage, it's not a secret demotion, it's not a conspiracy to bench someone prematurely. It's about insulation. Development thrives when scrutiny is delayed. Some of the league's most successful quarterback transitions have followed this pattern quietly. Veterans carry the load, younger players learn without the weight of the spotlight. The difference here is how visible everything else has become, making the buffering effect feel more deliberate.
Watson's presence allows Cleveland to avoid forcing a conversation before it needs to happen. They don't have to declare a future. They don't have to justify patience publicly. They can point to the current starter and say the situation is settled, even if it's evolving internally. That kind of plausible stability buys the organization flexibility. It allows them to pivot when timing aligns rather than when pressure demands it. Financially, the contract also reframes expectations. A player with that level of investment isn't benched lightly. That reality automatically pushes any alternative timeline farther out, whether intentional or not. And that distance creates space for learning, space for development, space for narrative shaping. If the goal is to transition smoothly rather than abruptly, this structure supports that outcome. Some fans view this as wasted time, others see it as mismanagement. But if you accept the buffer theory, the logic changes. The Browns aren't stuck, they're staging. They aren't delaying decisions, they're sequencing them. And sequencing matters when the stakes extend beyond wins and losses. When perception, confidence, and long-term value are in play, timing becomes everything. Again, none of this has been confirmed. It's a reading of patterns, not proclamations. But the quiet coexistence, the lack of urgency, and the absence of panic all support the idea that Watson's role right now extends beyond the box score. He's carrying the present so someone else can prepare for the future. And if that's true, then the Browns aren't reacting to circumstances, they're using them. There's an uncomfortable truth hovering over all of this that most people don't want to say out loud. The Cleveland Browns aren't measuring success the way they used to. Wins still matter, but they aren't the only scoreboard anymore. The organization appears to be playing a longer, quieter game, one where relevance, sustainability, and reach carry as much weight as the final record. And when you look at the timeline, it becomes clear this was never about fixing one season. It was about engineering the next phase of the franchise. The NFL has shifted, whether fans like it or not. Teams are now global content engines. Every snap is clipped, every quote is dissected, every player is a potential entry point for new audiences. In that environment, building slowly isn't weakness, it's discipline. Cleveland seems to understand that rushing a face of the franchise moment can permanently damage trust. Instead of forcing belief, they're letting it accumulate. That takes longer, but it lasts. On one hand, the logic is hard to ignore. The Browns have reduced chaos instead of feeding it. They've protected development instead of inflating expectations. They've aligned ownership, front office, and coaching rather than letting each tier pull in a different direction. That alone separates this approach from most quarterback experiments that fail before they even get started. From a structural standpoint, it's disciplined. From a business standpoint, it's coherent. And from a branding standpoint, it's undeniably calculated. On the other hand, the margin for error is razor thin. Patience only looks like confidence until it doesn't. If growth stalls, silence turns into suspicion. If results don't materialize, restraint gets rebranded as avoidance. The same qualities being praised now could be criticized later as refusal to adapt. That's the risk of playing the long game in a league that demands weekly proof. What makes this situation especially polarizing is that Cleveland appears comfortable living with that risk. They aren't hedging loudly. They aren't building escape routes in public view. They've chosen a direction and limited alternatives, which suggests belief, but belief cuts both ways. When it works, it looks visionary. When it doesn't, it looks stubborn. There's no middle ground once the outcome arrives. As for Shedeur Sanders, his role in all of this goes beyond performance. Fair or not, he's become the symbol of the Browns' patience, alignment, and ambition. His success wouldn't just validate a draft choice, it would validate an organizational philosophy that favors infrastructure over impulse. His failure wouldn't just disappoint fans, it would call the entire approach into question. That's why this story feels bigger than one player or one season. It's a test case, a franchise asking whether measured control can still win in a league addicted to reaction, whether brand building and football building can truly move in sync, whether waiting is still a weapon or just a delay tactic in disguise. The Browns aren't asking those questions publicly. They've already answered them internally. Now they're letting time do the talking. And when the moment finally arrives, whether quietly or all at once, the debate won't be about what happened. It'll be about whether we should have seen it coming all along.
It was supposed to be the calm before a long off-season reset. The Cleveland Browns had just moved on from their head coach. Fans were finally letting themselves breathe. And for the first time in a while, there was a sense that at least one major question had already been answered. After all the chaos, the injuries, the blown protection, and the constant dysfunction, the Browns finally had something they could build around. Or at least, that's what everyone thought. Then, one press conference shattered that illusion almost instantly. General Manager Andrew Berry stepped to the podium, and within minutes, Cleveland found itself right back where it always ends up. Confused, divided, and bracing for another quarterback controversy. With a few carefully chosen words, Berry managed to drain the optimism out of the room and replace it with uncertainty, the kind of uncertainty that Browns fans know all too well, the kind that turns hope into outrage before the microphones are even turned off. The frustrating part is that this didn't happen because something went wrong on the field. No bad throw, no collapse in a big moment, no off-field blow-up. This happened because the man in charge refused to say what fans believed was obvious. When asked directly about the future of the quarterback position, about Shedeur Sanders, Berry didn't offer reassurance. He didn't offer commitment. Instead, he offered hesitation. And in Cleveland, hesitation hits harder than bad news. For months, Browns fans had watched Shedeur Sanders grind through one of the worst situations a young quarterback can walk into: a broken offense, constant pressure, coaching instability. Yet somehow, the longer the season dragged on, the more he settled in. Drives became cleaner, decisions got quicker. Teammates rallied behind him. Even franchise cornerstones began speaking about him with respect. It felt like the story was writing itself: survive the chaos, earn the job, and finally give Cleveland a real direction. That's why what came next felt like a betrayal. Berry's words didn't just reopen a debate, they sent a message that maybe all that progress wasn't enough. Maybe the growth didn't matter. Maybe the Browns were once again unwilling to plant their flag and build around a young quarterback who fought through damn near impossible circumstances. And when you're a fan of this franchise, that silence, that hedging, that refusal to commit is louder than any outright criticism. Because this isn't just about one press conference. It's about a pattern, a cycle Cleveland has repeated for years. Find a quarterback, question him publicly, create unnecessary doubt, let pressure mount, and when things get shaky, act shocked that nothing worked out. That's why this moment matters. Not because Berry said something outrageous, but because he said just enough to make everyone wonder if the Browns learned absolutely nothing from their past. And here's the part that should really make fans uneasy. If a quarterback like Shedeur Sanders, who showed growth, resilience, and leadership in a broken system, still hasn't done enough to earn public confidence, then what exactly does this organization expect? What standard are they holding him to? And more importantly, who do they believe is realistically walking through that door to replace him? Because once you peel back the careful language and PR-safe phrasing, this situation starts to look a lot less like strategy and a lot more like the same old Browns problem wearing a different suit. And once you hear what Berry actually said and what it quietly implies about the team's real plans, it becomes impossible not to ask the question every Browns fan is thinking right now. Are we watching caution from a smart general manager, or the beginning of yet another quarterback disaster Cleveland helped create all on its own?
The shift didn't happen during a game. It didn't happen after a brutal loss or a season-ending interception. It happened quietly in a press conference room with polite questions, neutral tones, and answers that sounded safe on the surface but felt explosive underneath. The Cleveland Browns had already ripped off the bandage by moving on from Kevin Stefanski, and for a brief moment, it felt like the organization might finally embrace clarity instead of chaos. That moment didn't last long. When Andrew Berry stepped to the podium, the expectation wasn't fireworks. Nobody was asking him to solve the future in one afternoon. Fans understood there were evaluations to be made, interviews to conduct, contracts to navigate. What they wanted was direction, a signal, a sign that at least one pillar of the rebuild was already locked in. Instead, what they got felt like the ground shifting beneath their feet. The tone of the press conference was calm, almost clinical, but that's what made it unsettling. This wasn't a defensive GM under pressure. This was a calculated response, carefully worded, strategically vague, and yet the message landed like a gut punch. Because instead of using the moment to close the book on uncertainty, Barry opened a brand new chapter of doubt. Not about the past season, not about the coaching search, about the most important position in sports. What made it worse was the timing. This wasn't mid-season deflection or trade deadline ambiguity. This was the reset moment, the clean slate, the chance to stabilize the franchise after chaos. By refusing to draw a clear line in the sand, Barry didn't just keep his options open, he reopened wounds that Cleveland fans thought were finally healing, wounds built from years of indecision, short leashes, and half-commitments at quarterback. The reaction was immediate. Media members exchanged looks, social media lit up. Fans who had spent weeks convincing themselves that for once the Browns wouldn't overthink this felt that familiar sinking feeling return, the one that says, "Here we go again." Because Browns fans have learned something painfully well over the years. When leadership talks like this, it's never accidental, it's never meaningless, and it almost always leads somewhere nobody enjoys. This wasn't just another off-season press conference. This was the moment the narrative changed, the moment optimism stopped feeling safe, the moment everyone realized that whatever confidence had been built late in the season was far more fragile than it appeared. And once that door was cracked open, all the old questions came rushing back in. Because if the Browns weren't ready to commit now, after everything that happened, then when exactly were they planning to? And that question only gets louder once you understand why so many fans believe the quarterback debate had already been settled. For a lot of fans, the quarterback debate didn't quietly fade away. It ended decisively over the final stretch of the season. Not because everything suddenly became perfect, but because for the first time in years, the Browns finally had a young quarterback who didn't shrink under chaos. Shedeur Sanders stepped into a situation that would have broken most players and somehow managed to look steadier as things got worse around him. The offensive line leaked, play calls came in late, receivers struggled to separate. Yet week after week, Sanders stayed upright mentally, even when he couldn't stay clean in the pocket. The game slowed down for him. You could see it in his eyes, in the way he stopped forcing throws and started taking what defenses gave him. Drives that used to stall now ended in points. Late game
Possessions stopped feeling hopeless. For Browns fans conditioned to dread every third and long, that alone felt revolutionary. What really shifted the mood wasn't just the box score, it was the moments, the poise on game-deciding drives, the calm responses after hits that should have rattled him, the way teammates responded when things got tense. This wasn't empty optimism or fan fiction. It was tangible progress happening in real time. Progress in the middle of dysfunction, which made it feel even more legitimate. That belief only hardened when leaders inside the locker room started saying the quiet part out loud. When Myles Garrett, a player who has seen every version of this franchise, publicly spoke with respect about Sanders, it meant something. Garrett isn't known for handing out praise lightly, especially to quarterbacks. For fans, that endorsement carried real weight. It signaled that Sanders wasn't just surviving, he was earning trust where it actually matters. By the end of the season, the conversation had naturally shifted. It wasn't, "Can he play?" anymore. It was, "How do you build around this?" That's why many fans mentally checked the quarterback box and moved on to bigger issues, fixing the line, finding weapons, stabilizing coaching. Sanders felt like the rare part of the roster that didn't need constant reevaluation. And that's exactly why the press conference hit so hard, because it wasn't just walking back a decision that hadn't been announced. It felt like rewriting what everyone had just watched unfold with their own eyes.
If this wasn't enough, if surviving, improving, and leading under those conditions didn't earn confidence, then the standard suddenly felt impossible. For a fan base starved for stability, the idea that the Browns still weren't ready to say, "This is our guy," felt less like caution and more like denial. And once that doubt crept back in, the next question became unavoidable. If Sanders hadn't cleared the bar, what exactly does the front office believe will? What made this blow up wasn't a single dramatic quote or an obvious slight. In fact, on the surface, Andrew Berry sounded almost complimentary. That's what made it dangerous. He started by saying all the right things, the kind of praise that feels reassuring if you're only half paying attention. He talked about growth, about development, about seeing progress both physically and mentally. He mentioned improved accuracy, better playmaking, and strides in managing the pocket. On paper, it read like a vote of confidence, and for a few moments, it felt like the room relaxed. But in Cleveland, fans have learned to listen carefully to what comes after the praise, because the Browns' real truth is always hiding in the follow-up sentence. And sure enough, that's exactly where everything unraveled. The language shifted from acknowledgement to uncertainty, from reflection to hedging. Berry didn't challenge the idea that progress had happened, he diluted its meaning. The moment that set everything on fire wasn't loud or aggressive, it was subtle. A calm admission that the team still needed to do its work at quarterback. A reminder that the solution might be internal or external. In most organizations, those words might barely register. In Cleveland, they land like a warning shot, because everyone knows what they actually mean. They mean nothing is settled. They mean nobody is safe. They mean the clock is still ticking. That phrasing mattered more than anything else he said, not because it was shocking, but because it was familiar. Browns fans have heard this exact tone before, right before the franchise talks itself into
starting over again. It's the language of optional commitment, the kind that protects leverage in boardrooms while creating chaos everywhere else. And once those words were out there, the press conference stopped being about evaluation and started becoming about trust. What made it worse was how carefully it was delivered. This wasn't a GM caught off guard. This was measured, deliberate, almost rehearsed, which told fans something they didn't want to admit. This wasn't an accident. Berry wanted the door open. He wanted flexibility. And in doing so, he quietly undermined the momentum that had been built over months of on-field growth. The reaction wasn't outrage at first, it was confusion, then disbelief, then anger, because everyone watching understood the contradiction. How can a quarterback show clear development under horrible conditions and still be treated like a temporary solution? How can progress be real, tangible, and documented, yet still not enough to earn a public commitment? That's when the narrative flipped. This stopped being about responsible evaluation and became about messaging failure, about how saying the wrong thing at the wrong time can erase goodwill faster than a losing streak. And as media voices began dissecting every word, one reality became unavoidable. If the Browns truly believed in their quarterback, there would have been no reason to speak like this at all. And once the language exposed that hesitation, fans started asking the next logical question. If the front office is this unsure, what exactly are they seeing as a better alternative? Almost immediately after the press conference, the conversation pivoted to the draft. It always does. Anytime a team refuses to commit at quarterback, the draft becomes the easiest distraction, the cleanest way to justify uncertainty. And in Cleveland's case, it quickly turned into what felt less like a real plan and more like a smokescreen, a convenient talking point that sounds proactive without forcing any actual decisions. On the surface, the logic seems sound. You explore everything, you evaluate the class, you keep your options open. That's what Cleveland Browns fans were told. But the deeper you look at this draft landscape, the harder it becomes to believe that the Browns are truly positioning themselves to solve their quarterback situation this way.
Reports suggest the front office understands this, which makes the public flirtation with draft scenarios feel more like theater than strategy. This isn't one of those years where elite quarterback prospects are stacked at the top, forcing desperate teams into bold moves. This is a draft filled with question marks, developmental players, high ceilings paired with glaring concerns. That matters when you're holding a premium pick and already carrying major holes across your roster. Offensive line issues, limited weapons, depth concerns on defense. Using that level of draft capital on a quarterback who may need years to develop isn't aggressive, it's reckless. That's why many around the league aren't buying the idea that Cleveland is seriously preparing to pull the trigger. Trading up would require sacrificing future picks they can't afford to lose. Staying put means reaching for talent in a class that doesn't justify it. And all of that would be happening while a young quarterback who already showed real progress sits on the roster. It doesn't add up, not from a football standpoint, not from a roster building standpoint. And yet, the draft continues to be floated as a possibility, not because it's likely, but because it keeps leverage alive. It keeps fans guessing. It keeps agents wondering. It allows leadership to say they've explored every avenue without committing to one. That's why this feels less like preparation and more like positioning, a way to keep the conversation moving while avoiding a definitive stance.
What makes the draft talk especially hollow is that even if Cleveland did fall in love with someone, the cost would reshape the franchise in ways that rarely end well. Mortgaging multiple years of picks to chase a quarterback in a shaky class is how teams stay bad longer. It's how rebuilds stall out before they ever take shape. And history hasn't exactly shown that this organization thrives when it panics. That's why the draft angle feels like misdirection, something to point at while the front office comes to terms with what's actually available. Because once you strip away the hype, once you run the numbers, once you look at the roster honestly, the draft stops looking like a solution and starts looking like a talking point. And that realization leads directly into the most uncomfortable truth Cleveland is trying to dance around. If the draft isn't a realistic escape hatch, then the Browns are forced to confront what's already in the building, and that's when this situation becomes impossible to spin. No matter how carefully the Browns word their plans, there's one reality they can't talk their way around, one name that keeps looming over every conversation, every draft projection, every hypothetical quarterback plan: Deshaun Watson. And not because of performance, potential, or upside, but because of a contract that has quietly boxed the franchise into a corner. This is the part nobody in the organization wants to say out loud. The Browns are financially tied to Watson in a way that makes most normal quarterback decisions impossible. The guaranteed money, the cap impact, the structure of the deal, it all adds up to a situation where moving on simply isn't realistic, at least not yet. Cutting him isn't an option, trading him is almost unthinkable, and pretending otherwise only delays the inevitable. Before the